Welcome, everyone. It's great to see you this afternoon. I see some familiar names on the list of attendees, so hello. Welcome to Share's second online religious investor workshop of 2020. My name's Kaylie Tiessen. I'll be moderating today's session. I'm very pleased to be with you for this conversation. I love having conversations like this, as many of my friends will attest to and maybe warn you about. I'm a member of the board of Abundance Canada. Abundance Canada is a donor-driven, faith-based foundation, kind of growing out of the Mennonite community here in Canada. I'm also an economist and a policy analyst at Unifor, Canada's largest private sector trade union, and I'm a director at Kindred Credit Union in Southwestern Ontario. So today's discussion is really of great interest to me. This video conference brings together more than 75 investor representatives of religious communities, denominations, parishes, pension funds, endowments, and educational institutions from across the country to examine what it means to be a responsible investor in the time of COVID-19. I'm sure many of you have had these sorts of questions over the last 8 months. I definitely have. 90 minutes in plenary as well as in small group discussions, we're going to explore this really important topic. To start off our session, I'd like to invite Carmen Diston, who is congregational leader at the Institute of the Blessed Virgin Mary, to offer an opening prayer. Carmen.
Okay. We begin with a song, Gather Us, O God, and I invite you to sing from wherever you are. Gather us, O God, body, spirit, soul, and mind. Gather us, O God, one in union now with you. Together, gather us, O God, body, spirit, soul, and mind. Gather us, O God, one in union now with you. One last time. Gather us, O God, body, spirit, soul, and mind. Gather us, O God, one in union now with you. We acknowledge the land where some of us are today is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. Treaty 13 began as the long-disputed Toronto Purchase Treaty in the 1780s. In 1805, a new agreement was signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, with the Crown paying a sum of 10 shillings. In 1998, claims against the government were filed. In 2010, the Government of Canada settled the Toronto Purchase and Brant Tract claims with financial compensation of $154 million. Through learning this history, our treaty history, we seek a new relationship with the original peoples of this land, one based in honor and deep respect. Please call to mind the territory where you are today and give thanks. Let's take a moment together to arrive here. Note where you are, how your day has unfolded so far. Be conscious of the divine within and around. Be aware of any competing interests for your time and attention this afternoon. and let them go as best you can for this hour and a half. This month of November is a time of remembering and perhaps a time of preparation for winter. Some of us had snowflakes today. Let's think of it not only as recalling, but of learning lessons and remembering, an invitation to put back together, especially where our societies, nations, lands experience disruption and inequities. The time to influence and to contribute to building a more just world. We listen and act with hope. This day in 1993 in South Africa, 21 political parties approved a new constitution, expanding voting rights and ending white minority rule. Change is possible. We will hear conversation today about the strengths and weaknesses exposed by the pandemic, especially in the healthcare and pharmaceutical sectors. To ready ourselves for this conversation, let's listen to Lynn Ungar's poem, Pandemic. What if you thought of it as the Jews consider the Sabbath, the most sacred of times? Cease from travel, cease from buying and selling. Give up just for now on trying to make the world different than it is. Sing, pray, touch only those to whom you commit your life. Center down. And when your body has become still, reach out with your heart. Know that we are connected in ways that are terrifying and beautiful. You could hardly deny it now. Know that our lives are in one another's hands. Surely that has come clear. Do not reach out your hands. Reach out your heart. Reach out your words. Reach out all the tendrils of compassion that move invisibly where we cannot touch. Promise this world your love, for better or for worse, in sickness and in health, so long as we all shall live. And in this spirit, from love, we move to conversation and opportunities for influence.
Thank you, Carmen, for grounding and centering us this afternoon in this conversation. So our workshop has 3 parts. We will start with some introductions. You'll all be sort of put in table groups, followed by a panel discussion and ending with an interview with Michael Ring of the Services Employees International Union about their work with investors and the long-term care sector. Michael's a new addition to our agenda today. Unfortunately, Renee Manley is unable to join us, but fortunately for her and for all of us, the reason that she is unable to be here is that she's been appointed as a member of US President-elect Biden's transition team, which means she can't be speaking publicly at this time. And we're very looking forward to hearing what Michael has to say. So at an in-person conference, by now you would have all sort of introduced yourself to your table mates, said hello, let them know where you're from. And through the magic of Zoom, with the help of Damon, we're going to give you a chance to meet some virtual table groups of 8 people. So please take a moment to introduce yourself and share a thought about what a healthy profit means to you. After 10 minutes, we'll be returned automatically to the whole meeting. So please make sure everybody has a chance to say something. That means you each get about 60 seconds. Your videos will be turned on during the small group discussion portion of this, but then we'll turn them off during the panel discussion and only the panelists' videos will be on. that helps to keep a stronger signal. And if at any time you experience problems with your signal, just turn your video off, as that sort of helps with bandwidth issues. Okay, let's get started with the introductions. Everybody's coming back. Looks like things have populated. Great, welcome back everyone. I always am so interested to hear how different people are talking about social good, integrating it into their lives, and it kind of helps me distill and figure out how I can actually integrate social good and those sorts of decisions more into my daily life as well. So we have these three panelists today, but before I introduce them, I want to mention two housekeeping items. The first one is that during the next sort of panel discussion, there will be a couple of poll questions. We'll ask you to vote on these questions. A dialogue box is going to pop up prompting you to select an answer, a pre-populated answer. You'll have 10 seconds to respond. It sounds like a short amount of time, but it's not. 10 seconds is a very long amount of time in those instances. So let's test it out. Damon's going to launch the question, just asking, where are you logging in from? And then we can get an idea of where everybody is today. See, 10 seconds is longer than you think. And I think that we're going to see the results of the poll, but I'll go along to, oh, here we go. So 70% of us from Ontario, 7% from the US, from the Atlantic, the West Coast, the prairies. Very representative of our Canadian geography today. So it's nice to see that. Okay. Housekeeping item number 2. If you have a question for the panel, I'm going to do my best to integrate them all. I have a ton of questions for the panel. Many of you do as well. So you can click on the text box, the chat box in the bottom of your screen. If you click on it, it'll pop open. You can write your question privately to me or publicly to everyone in the group. And I will do my best to integrate those questions into our panel discussion today. All right, so the next section is the panel. I'm going to introduce you to our three panelists and then we'll get into the questions. First, we have Jennifer Coulson. She's the Vice President of ESG Investing at British Columbia Investment Management Corporation. BCI manages more than $125 billion for public sector pension funds and government entities in the province of BC. She leads a team of 5 analysts, all focused on investor stewardship. So totally after my own heart there. Our second panelist is Donna Meyer. She's the Director of Shareholder Advocacy at Mercy Investment Services. Mercy Investments is a service of the Sisters of Mercy of the Americas. Donna holds a PhD from the University of Texas School of Public Health, and she co-chairs Investors for Opioid and Pharmaceutical Accountability. Complicated and highly interesting topic. And Anthony Schein is Director of Shareholder Engagement here at Share. He oversees Share's shareholder engagement program for pension funds, endowments, religious and Indigenous investors with combined assets of more than 50 billion. He also has a passion for fairness and inclusion, which I have witnessed many times as we've interacted in our professional lives, and a passion as well for building a democratic economy that works for everyone. So welcome here. All right, my first question is to all three panelists. I think we'll start with Anthony and then move to Donna and then to Jennifer. In broad strokes and in 60 seconds or less, because we only have 40 minutes, tell us what a healthy profit means to you.
Thanks for that question. I'll do my best on the 60 seconds, and nice to see you all. Nice to be with everyone virtually today. I've been thinking a lot about that question since it is so topical right now in light of the pandemic, when we've seen some companies on one extreme end making money hand over fist in a way that you could probably only describe as profiteering. And then on the other hand, so many companies and so many individuals really struggling to survive. So to answer the question, I kind of charted out what I think makes for a fair profit. So, or for a healthy profit, I should say. A healthy profit is what's earned after you've met these kind of conditions. You've provided a fair wage to the people who work for you to support individuals, families, and communities. That's first criteria number one. You've paid a fair price for the materials you need to produce that product. You've treated the land and the resources your business relies on with respect and in a sustainable way, including respecting the original inhabitants of that land. And you provide a product that you stand behind with pride. And finally, you've reinvested to ensure that your operation can thrive in the future, whether that's research and development or new equipment. There's some squiffy words I know in there, like fair and reasonable and that sort of thing. And I guess, reasonable people can disagree about what exactly a fair wage is. But I think if you're not checking off all of those boxes, your profit really isn't healthy. Of course, there's those people who say that, who look at it from the other side and think your profit might be unhealthy because it's too small. And that often comes up in regard to minimum wage increases, when some sort of business lobbies say that their members can't afford to pay a higher minimum wage. And I guess in my view on that, if your business model can't sustain a fair wage, then your business model is what's unhealthy in that case. So I'll leave it there for now.
Thanks, Anthony. Donna, why don't we go to you next?
Sorry about that. I need to unmute faster. I love Anthony's response, actually. We could just stick with that. I thought about it a little bit different in my definition, although it doesn't conflict with what Anthony said at all. But I said that it needs to be a fair return that balances their financial return with the social and environmental good they produce. And he outlined what environmental and social goods are. I've always worked for Catholic organizations since I've been doing this work for about 20 years. And fortunately, when you work for Catholic congregations, they tend to identify their critical concerns very carefully. And so you really have guidelines, I guess you'd say protocols to go for in what you consider the social and environmental good that we're looking for. I think for every business, it's a little bit different. Often when I talk about that balance, I use simple Walgreens. I think it doesn't matter to bring up a company where they say a good part of their profits come from tobacco. And so then it's a good example for the lay public to understand how we balance the financial return with social and environmental good. It's something everyone can understand.
Thank you, Donna. And Jennifer, over to you.
Yes, good afternoon, everybody. I guess that, the way we think about it here is obviously, we are shareholders, and the profits that companies make ultimately benefit the beneficiaries of the pension plans that we're managing money for. But that doesn't mean that, companies should not be thinking about other stakeholders. So, we would approach it just more in terms of a stakeholder model where, yes, shareholders were part of the equation and the conversation, but we are by no means, the only stakeholder in wanting to, see a company be healthy and be profitable in a way that benefits all other stakeholders. So I'll leave it at that.
Wonderful. Thank you very much to all three of you. Okay, my next question is for Jennifer. Anthony mentioned fair pay, fair fair and reasonable workplace conditions, all of those sorts of things. So in your experience through this pandemic, what are some of the priority workplace issues that have been raised by COVID-19, and what should investors expect from the companies in which they invest? Are some sectors particularly vulnerable to workplace impacts of COVID-19?
Yeah, great. I think this will kind of kick us off at a high level, and we'll be able to dig into the details with everybody else. But I think about that question like almost in two different camps. From a worker perspective, I mean, there's people like me who have the option, to work from home. I'm in the office today, but I have the option to work from home, and most of our workforce is actually working from home. So we have very different issues than a worker who is a frontline worker, right? Whether that's in healthcare, education, or if you're, working in the private sector, it's, businesses like the grocers, really essential services where, you don't have the option, right? People need to show up for work, and that still needs to be done in a safe way. So there's very different expectations, I would say, for companies, operating in both of those dimensions, and many companies are operating in both, right? Where they do have frontline workers as well as, office or corporate workers that are in very different situations. So obviously for the frontline workers, safety has to be, top priority. And we see this, across our portfolio that, if workers are not feeling safe and they're not working in a safe environment, then that's not going to lead to great results for anybody. So safety has to be top of mind. What we're seeing a lot, particularly in the US, because there's less of a social safety net in many respects. Things as simple as a sick leave policy are not always there for workers. So, you put that into the context of a pandemic where you really need people to stay home if they're not feeling well. So regardless of a pandemic, there's other reasons to have those, paid sick leave policies. But in a pandemic, it's especially important to stop the spread of COVID-19. So that would be, a very basic policy, or what I would consider a very basic policy that sometimes is just not there. I think we also need a way for workers to be able to bring forward concerns that they might have. So, if you are working in an environment where you're not feeling safe, what do you do with that? Where do you go? Who do you talk to? And, the more kind of formal procedures that you can have around that to ensure that, worker concerns are being addressed, I think the better. And then, of course, we have to deal with the job loss issue. So, we know that sometimes, there are going to be job losses involved, but I think we would want companies to consider alternatives to that before they make any drastic decisions. And if they do ultimately have to, lay some workers off or put workers on furlough, it's done in a very responsible way, in a way that, there's lots of notice. They work with, other partners to make sure that people have training and other opportunities. There's a way to, I think, do that responsibly. Whereas I think when you talk about, workers that are in more of an office environment, we're seeing much more emphasis on things like mental health. Right. So how do you deal with the anxiety of people that, may be all alone, in a 1-bedroom apartment or maybe even smaller, where they just don't have that social interaction. So that we see a lot of emphasis on mental health in companies like that, and also just flexibility. So how do you offer workers flexibility around working from home, on a more permanent basis? I think a lot of companies are thinking about that, that maybe we don't need to be in the office 5 days a week, but people now have so many other responsibilities, right? So whether it's childcare, whether it's elder care, or just caring for people in the community that, can't get out as much, all of that requires flexibility. And of course, there's added workloads, right? I think people are working in different ways, and that is adding to a lot of people's workload, which gets me back, I guess, to anxiety and mental health, where we would expect companies to be paying particular attention to that.
All right, thank you very much. My next question is for Donna. We've heard a lot about a vaccine just in the last sort of 10 days even. Potentially it's coming soon. What are some of the issues that responsible investors should be looking out for in the pharmaceutical industry as well as other industries? And what can we learn about this situation from ongoing work in the opioids sector?
So I think Jennifer did a great job of describing the kinds of issues that so many companies have that are frontline companies. For example, the retailers, the pharmacies, the distributors, everything Jennifer said applies. But when you start talking about pharmaceutical manufacturers, those who are manufacturing the vaccines, those who are manufacturing the treatments, those who are manufacturing even the tests, we're really talking about a different ballgame in that the pandemic has created great new sales opportunities for them. And they're flourishing. Their shares are up close to 10% this year. I bet you don't find that in any of the entertainment industry or the travel industry, right? And so our concern about these vaccines and treatments, when I say vaccines, I want you all to know that we're talking about vaccines, treatments, tests, anything that is used to combat the pandemic. We believe that the rich should not receive access, that it shouldn't be based just on money. And we're really concerned about this whole concept of vaccine nationalism. I guess that's a new word in our lexicon, or a new phrase in our lexicon, this vaccine nationalism. Our government will pay the most, and so we should get first dibs. We're concerned that vaccines should go to people in need, and we believe in public health metrics which say the diseases don't know where the borders are. In other words, between the United States and Mexico, the virus doesn't see the Rio Grande River, right? And so close to 1.5 million people around the globe have died. And we think that we should be all part of the World Health Organization and their accelerator project. We think that there should be means to make sure that these vaccines get to low and middle income countries as well as the high income countries. And I think when we talk with companies, they are at least articulating their agreement with us. And in fact, Kevin, I know, was on the call last week with Lily, and Lily actually has a written statement or guideline that they've posted that says that they believe that we should ensure equitable access to our medicine at a fair price. Medicine must be available to patients with the greatest unmet need and not sold to the highest bidder. So at least they are articulating that. I am not sure that everyone I'm not sure that they won't end up following the money in the end. And so I guess our first concern is this access concern, and that people get affordable access. Then we have a second concern on the vaccines and treatments, and that is that we think taxpayers shouldn't have to pay twice for these treatments. And I think you probably all know that Canada, for example, gave Accelera $175 million to develop the antibody treatment. And that's great. But then Canadian people shouldn't have to pay again when it becomes available for treating the disease. So we're filing a resolution with those companies that got large amounts of public support, and we're simply asking whether they can explain to us how this receipt of public support is factored into their pricing decisions. Now, in other words, do they take that into account when they decide on the final price? So I think you can see here that the whole issue of pharmaceutical companies is quite different than the majority of the companies that are really suffering from the pandemic. As far as how what we've done with opioids translates, that was an interesting question. Obviously, it's a pandemic, and opioids was an epidemic, right? Or is an epidemic. I should say, I've got to get 2 cents worth in for opioids. You know, the COVID is consuming us. It's consuming this call, which is wonderful. But the opioid epidemic is getting worse. So let's not put it on the back burner. Let's remember that as we move forward. But I think there are a couple things that we've really learned from the opioid work. One is that lots of investors are interested in both. And so the IOPA, for example, has between 60 and 70 members now. We've never had that many people work on any healthcare issue in my entire lifetime. So it's really something that everyone understands and is interested in. So I think that helps. And then the very intense public interest means that it's easy to get press releases, news articles, and so forth. So you might say that we've got the wind at our backs, right? The press is eager to cover this, and so that helps give us a lot of support and clout.
Thank you. And I have a follow-up for Jennifer and Donna. I'm going rogue, so Anthony, I'll get to you in a minute. Donna, you mentioned asking the question, getting agreement with your investors, or the folks that you're investing in, the companies you're investing in. How do you make sure you're moving, or is it possible to make sure that you're moving from agreement to action by those companies?
You mean in terms of making sure that the distribution goes to as many people as possible, and that it's equitable, and the access is available everywhere? Well, that's a really good question, and maybe someone else on the phone can answer it better than I can. Other than by keeping tabs of them every month and then setting up another call and reminding them again that we are concerned about what they are doing. I have to say that what we're seeing so far is that they're hearing us loud and clear, and I'm sure you all are not far enough away to not realize that they are getting a lot of pressure on the other side from our federal government. And so it's a little bit of a struggle, because they get the pressure from the governments to provide the vaccines to the countries. And I don't think you can blame just the United States, although sometimes I think our pressure is harder. But Germany has paid hundreds of millions of dollars to get a vaccine there first. And other countries have paid money so that they get the vaccine first. I guess our approach to that has been that we maybe can't grab vaccine away from the country that produces it. In other words, if the factory is in Germany and the people in Germany do not have enough vaccine, it's hard to tell them that they need to send some of it to Kenya or to South Africa, right? But what we can say to them is, you have the know-how, you have the patents, you have the expertise. What are you doing to make sure that manufacturers all over the world are indeed able to replicate that product? And this is another example from the Lilly dialogue last week. They said they had a whole team of experts that are going to these, what I'd call generic producers, manufacturers around the world and helping them gear up for the vaccine. And I think, or for the antibody treatment. And I think that's what we've got to push, is how do we spread that knowledge, that ability to produce it all over the world. It's far more likely that an Indian manufacturer will get the vaccine to India than it is to think that a manufacturer in Denmark will send it to India, if that makes sense. I don't know if that's fair or not. I'd love to hear others on that, but that's kind of where we've come down.
Okay, it sounds like there's a little bit of just making sure your voice is heard over and over again, and providing potentially ideas that the board or executive team wouldn't think about on their own, or wouldn't even come into sort of their window of view. Jennifer, is there anything that you want to add to that?
Only to say that, I mean, I agree. There's, you know, we just have to always be there asking the questions and holding people accountable, right? So if you have one conversation and certain things are said, then it's really important to follow up and make sure that, you know, you're continuing to bring the issue forward, because, you know, sometimes these dialogues, they do take time. Right? I mean, I think, Donna, you've been at this a lot longer than I have, but it's that persistence, right? That really does pay off, and it has to be heard.
Thank you. Okay, and Anthony, you've been focused on long-term care in Ontario as well as across Canada. What has Share discovered about the impact of COVID on the real estate and nursing home sectors, and how are you addressing the issues, you know, particularly around how funding comes from the public sector, private, or profit goes to the private sector, all of those issues? I'm very interested to hear what you've been working on.
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about those. I'm glad that you narrowed it on those two particular industries, because those are areas that have been, I think, a focus of Share's work since even the before time, for the straightforward reason that these sectors tend to be some of the most vulnerable in terms of their workforces. You know, for a few reasons. I mean, the workforces in both commercial real estate and in long-term care are disproportionately women, workers of color, and in the Canadian context, newcomers as well. So, you know, they've been focus areas for shareholders and for, you know, trade unions and labor rights advocates for a long time. Just think about some of the jobs we're talking about there, just to put it in your mind. You know, in the real estate side, we're mostly talking about office cleaners, security guards, maintenance staff, caretakers, janitorial staff. Those are often relatively solitary jobs, you know, lone worker in the office after hours. You know, it's shift work so much of the time. And in the long-term care section, you know, somebody made this comment to me yesterday after hearing a reference to a nursing home, that it's actually, we don't call it a nursing home anymore. And one of the reasons for that is that increasingly there aren't nurses working in nursing homes. So that shift has been, in terms of the workforce there. I mean, there's other reasons why the names have changed too, but a big part of it is that there's been a shift from in the kinds of care and work that occurs there, from those, you know, credentialed and regulated kinds of jobs in nursing, where you have a professional college in Ontario and elsewhere, and a real set definition of what a nurse is, and coming with that higher wages, to what, you know, we often just shorthand as a PSW, which of course stands for personal support worker, and many other classifications of jobs like that. That's like really crucial work. It's some of, I would say, the hardest physically and emotionally that anyone could imagine. And it's also low paid, it's relatively unregulated, and it's not credentialed in a way that is, you know, really in contrast with that nursing work. And, you know, consequently, as I said, it's some of the lowest paid work. Often those are workers making just over the minimum wage, and they're often relying on part-time work as well. Just to, you know, thinking about what those jobs are and why, you know, they are so hard. You know, these are people who are responsible for, oftentimes, for feeding and bathing and dressing our elders every day. And in the current circumstances, that's even more challenging. And I'll just editorialize a little bit. Like these are jobs that I think, like childcare work, like other forms of care work, should really get the maximum kind of recognition and respect. And both of these two industries have been really hard hit by the pandemic in their own sort of separate, but I think similar ways. But I just had quickly on the value of that care work, just because I saw this yesterday, and I think it's worth sharing here. I saw this from Jim Sanford, who some of you may know as, I guess, Kaylie's former colleague as a Unifor economist. He's now director of the Center for Future Work in Canada and Australia. And he was giving a talk yesterday that, of course, in COVID times, I was able to tune in for a couple minutes of, because it was online, and I saw the tweets about it. The subject of the talk at Ryerson University was called "More Than STEM: Myth and Reality of Technology, Degrees, and Jobs." So I'll put this slide in the chat in a moment. But effectively, he was really just talking in the context of future work and how we plan for that. That contrary to what I think so many people often think about jobs of the future being high tech. In fact, all the projections and even the Canadian government's projections are that those care jobs will be the majority of future jobs. In elder care, child care, as I mentioned, health and food service work, and none of those jobs can be replaced by technology. And I think the reason for that is that they have that human element, and they do need to be valued appropriately. So I'll share the stats in the chat in a second, but I just wanted to share that. So in terms of how those industries have been affected, starting on the sort of real estate piece of things, it's certainly, I think, no surprise based on everything that we've all experienced and others' comments so far that the bottom line has been hit, particularly in commercial real estate. Retail, restaurants, hospitality, these have all been devastated. And just thinking about what restaurants look like, we might imagine that it's like Kaylie's Diner, that is the restaurant hard hit. But a huge number of those restaurants are, and other hospitality businesses are, chain restaurants operating in lease spaces in a property owned by a real estate trust like CBRE or whatever it is. If you think about your smart center in a suburban strip mall that has like a Swiss Chalet or a Montana's or Kelsey's on the corner, that's a big portion of the hospitality business. From an investor perspective, I think the pandemic has had a really significant impact on commercial real estate, including putting health and safety standards at the forefront of risk management. And we've done some research on that I'll share with you. But through our colleagues at the Canadian Capital Stewardship Network, which is a part of Share's work, we did a recent report on this and some research. In Canada, 10 of the largest institutional investors allocate about 220 billion or 13% of their total portfolios to real estate. And these are some really safe and leading asset classes, including commercial properties and major shopping centers. Again, I'll share that report in the chat in a moment. We've really seen how the workforce has been hit by those changes in commercial real estate and particularly in offices, with so many of us, as Jennifer mentioned, working remotely and so many offices having been basically shuttered for the last 8 months, so much of the time. So earlier in the year, the network published a set of expectations for real estate operators about how they would manage through this, including some of the pieces that Jennifer mentioned around how to deal with potential workforce reductions or anything like that. And it's been really clear that health and safety is a crucial part of both protecting workers' rights there, but also in restoring some confidence for workers coming, for office tenants coming back, and for shoppers going into those mall spaces again. So making sure that there's mitigation measures like physical distancing and appropriate cleaning, and all of those really do require a really heavy reliance on workers to do that extra cleaning and to sometimes enforce those rules. So a key piece of this is about allocating time and training to to those staff. Just referencing back to that CCSN report, there's some pretty significant shortcomings in how the sector is doing so far based on the research that we've done. So these are just a couple of stats from that report. In non-unionized office buildings, 80% of cleaning staff don't have access to adequate paid sick days in the middle of a global pandemic. So that really is both a public health issue and obviously an individual issue that's really crucial. 66% of non-unionized workers and 49% of unionized workers having increased workload during COVID, extra cleaning responsibilities, that sort of thing. So they're working harder, don't have that protection. And about a third of both union and non-union workers report that they have, that they haven't had additional hours to do that extra work. So the CCSN has been working with owners on that and has set some clear expectations and recommendations about what can be done. So that's sort of part of what to get a question about what the response should be. So there's three recommendations. They're pretty straightforward. And in some ways they seem like the sorts of things that we shouldn't have to recommend. They should be kind of common sense, but here we are. So one is to make sure that there is, to the greatest extent possible, that kind of stable continuation of income and benefits. If there are layoffs or anything like that, quarantine or time for dependent care, and to limit any financial impacts. And that's should be pretty straightforward. It's in the we expect these businesses to recover, and they're going to want their workforces back at the end of this. So taking care of the workforce matters that way. Second one is just to ensure basic health and safety. Again, I have to wonder why we have to make these recommendations, but they do need to be there, including making sure that everyone has the appropriate personal protective equipment to do their jobs appropriately. And then the last one is one that has been part of our work for a long time, which is to enforce or adopt policies such as a responsible procurement policy or responsible contractor policy that really sets a standard for those operators in terms of how they deal with some of those subcontracted pieces. So Jennifer's colleagues at BCI have are referenced in that report, and they've done quite well on these matters in their own portfolio. So I will share that link though. In terms of the long-term care side, it's a bit of a different piece because the issues are similar in terms of demand on workers and in terms of the health and safety issues, but our approach has been a little bit different in that we've really taken it on from a shareholder engagement kind of perspective, and we've really been working at it that way. Long-term care and for-profit long-term care was already part of our engagement work plan for this year. Before the pandemic, we already had this in mind. But engaging with operators like Chartwell or Sienna Living, those have been in the news lately, just went further up our priority list. Our plan originally, and still the case, was to engage them as part of our Valuing Decent Work initiative, which is focused in this case on governance of oversight of decent work in company operations. So we really want to have a strong level of board level oversight for the workforce throughout a company, and that's true across different sectors. We found in preparing, again, even before the pandemic, that the oversight in this sector was pretty weak, and it's just been underscored since then. I'll be honest, of course, that so far the response from these operators has not been like super receptive. Like, it hasn't been the best, although of course these things are ongoing, and we hope to get to good outcomes with them. I think that's partly because they're dealing with a real ongoing crisis in their homes, and I don't think I have to tell you all that, but I'll just share a couple of stats to underscore that.
We actually only have a few minutes left. So
okay, I will wrap it up there.
Sorry.
And just say it's going to be a priority. I'll share a couple other things in the chat. Sorry.
That's okay. It's fascinating information, and something that is top of mind for so many of us as we're watching what's happening in the long-term care sector, Quebec, Ontario, BC. Definitely top of mind, and absolutely share all of that information in the chat. So we have a few minutes left in this panel, and I am going to ask another question, but first we're going to get to a poll question for everyone. We'll get Damon to pop that up. The question is, have you discussed the implications for workers and communities of the COVID-19 pandemic with your investment manager? And the answer is simply yes or no. Okay, and while we're waiting for those results, I have one sort of final question for the panelists. It's going to be a hybrid, but we only have 5 minutes for all three of you. 2 questions. Has anything changed in your portfolio as a result of the pandemic? And what is one action that that you would recommend the folks on this panel and watching this panel take in order to move the needle forward and have their eyes on a healthy profit? So those 2 things. And let's start with Jennifer.
Sure. In terms of changes, I would say I mean, I can't speak to specific changes, you know, in terms of companies or even sectors, but for sure, when the pandemic, you know, really kind of set in at the beginning, you know, we were looking at our active positions overall, you know, across all of the asset classes, and particularly in the more liquid positions where we felt the risks were, you know, just too high. You know, some changes were made, but I would say the biggest change is just, and everyone is talking about this, which I think is great, that social issues have just really come to the forefront. And in terms of our engagement priorities, you know, we always had human rights, you know, broadly. But in the past, what came to mind when you thought about human rights was, you know, a mining company operating, you know, in a jurisdiction that didn't have, you know, great regulation. Whereas now I think we're much more focused on human capital management and, you know, what those practices look like for companies. So we have actually launched a collaborative engagement with other global investors focused on human capital and how companies are responding to COVID-19. In terms of what I would recommend, you know, to this audience, I mean, you have investment portfolios that you might, you know, have a role in talking to your investment managers, and you can certainly be more selective with the asset managers that you work with. There's no shame in doing that. So making sure that, you know, you're asking the right questions up front before the asset manager is even hired. But then if you have asset managers that you are working with currently, it's asking questions, right? Ask about their stewardship practices, ask about their proxy voting record, how they're using their influence to think more long-term. And yeah, I think that's probably enough.
Thank you very much. Okay, and so to Donna and Anthony, each of you in 30 seconds, if you could answer one of those 2 questions, that would be great. Has anything changed in your portfolio, and what's a question that investment committee should be asking?
This is kind of related rather than direct, but we decided at Mercy that rather than switching our engagements, we would think of COVID and racial justice as overlays. In other words, are we also discussing them as part of our other engagements? And so we put a place on our electronic tracker for us to indicate. And this morning, because of this, I took a peek, and it looks like on almost all of our engagements, whether it's oil and gas or whether it's mining or whether it's health, people have checked the box that they have overlaid COVID onto existing engagements and actions. So I think that's very telling in and of itself.
Thank you. Okay, and Anthony, final word.
So I'll just agree with everything that's been said so far on that. Share doesn't, you know, we're not an owner or manager, but certainly many of the participants in our network have made similar changes or are thinking about similar questions or changes. I would just say, you know, get active and pay attention to what's happening, and certainly being on today's call and in our last session and our upcoming sessions is a great way to start.
Thank you. And to everyone who's listening, there has been some great information being posted in the chat. If you want to take a look, you can see some of the different things that the government is saying they're going to do, some questions about whether or not they'll actually follow through with what they're going to do. I share those. I share those questions for sure, and it's great to see this discussion is moving forward. Unfortunately, that is all the time we have for this portion of the afternoon. Let's give our panelists a sort of warm round of Zoom applause. Thank you very much. Yeah, I can see the hands waving. That's great. So thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
The final section of our workshop is a conversation between Share CEO Kevin Thomas and Michael Ring. Michael is Assistant Director of Strategic Initiatives at the Service Employees International Union. It's a union that represents hundreds of thousands, I imagine, of workers in many sectors deeply affected by COVID-19, including the nursing home and long-term care sector. Michael has worked with SEIU members and leaders for over 17 years, focused on retirement security and capital stewardship in support of SEIU's vision for a just society. We're very much looking forward to that conversation, but before we start, we have one more poll question for everyone. Do you agree with the following statement? Only governments can solve the long-term care problem. Shareholders don't have a role to play. So you can provide your answer, and while we're waiting for the results, I will turn it over to Kevin. Take it away.
Well, thanks. And you can hear me okay? Everything good? Great. Okay. I actually do appreciate that poll question. It may seem kind of like a loaded one, but it's really the subject that we want to talk with Michael about, because it isn't as simple as saying shareholders or governments have a particular role to play. They have different roles to play, and we're not exactly sure sometimes where that interaction is. In fact, this happens in a number of different kinds of engagements we do, where there's activity on the regulatory side and activity on the from the workers involved and activity from investors, and they may be complementary, or sometimes they may actually butt heads. So we want to explore that a bit in this particular context. And Michael, I mean, I have to say first, well, we're sorry Renee isn't here to speak with us. We're really happy to see good people like yourself on the transition team for Biden. Especially, I know she's working in the area of financial regulations and markets, and she's going to have a great influence there. That is just great to hear. For one, we're all looking to the end of the circus down south, and we're hoping to see not just that, but actually some more positive moves from the incoming administration. Actually, we were hosting Share is hosting an annual conference right now for our global committee on workers' capital, a global committee of, or a network of pension trustees. And we had the former Chief Justice of the Delaware Supreme Court on this morning, Leo Schein, and he was speaking about some of the things, quite some really positive things that he thinks the Biden administration may do to improve both corporate governance and also outcomes for workers. So that was music to my ears. I thought it was a great presentation, and I really, just to say, I hope Renee has great experience on the transition team. But I also have to say, for the benefit of everybody here, that having you on here, Michael, is not a consolation prize by any stretch. I've known Michael for some time, and I've just been so thoroughly impressed. Your hard work, your dedication, your creativity, your thoughtfulness. We've worked together to make sure that basic rights get respected in specific cases, and I think Michael's helped some of Canada's largest institutional investors look at risks in their private market investments that they might otherwise have caught. So he's been really thoughtful about this, and just a really smart player in this space. So I'm really happy you're here today. That's all that just to say I'm really happy you're here, and let's get into it.
Well, thanks, so Kevin. And before you jump into any of the questions, yeah, I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. Appreciated the thoughts of the previous panelists, who all, I thought, raised really important issues that will bring some continuity to here. And there is no substitute for the great Renee Manley. I've worked with Renee for over a decade. She's a star in this space and just in general. And I do think she's really, she regrets not having the opportunity, because she actually thought as of this morning she could join all of us in this conversation. And yet somebody at a security clearance this morning said, Renee, no, you cannot. So I'm happy to be here and to do the best I can to step into her shoes, and really appreciate the opportunity.
Well, much as I'd like to think that we're just as important as the president-elect, I'm willing to let him have this one. So anyway, so the poll, I mean, that does pose an interesting question, and we'll try to get to that. But actually, before we get to the issue of like regulatory versus shareholder action or the interplay between those, I want to get back to long-term care specifically. Your union, I mean, the SEIU represents thousands of workers in the sector, and if there's one thing the COVID crisis has laid bare for us all, it's that there's appalling wages, working conditions for those frontline workers in a lot of these centers. So maybe just revisit a bit the critical issues for long-term care workers and maybe what you're asking governments and employers to do in terms of addressing them.
Sure. Those are a couple of really important questions, and I'll try to be cogent and brief, but you can feel free to interrupt if I kind of roll on here. Let me just say that in general, I think the good news for all of us who are sitting on this call, and clearly many people who are skilled practitioners in the space of the intersection between shareholder work and policy work and worker justice, I mean, the work from our point of view is essential, and there's much work to be done. So SEIU has a long history of doing this work, and I've been very fortunate to have the members support us doing this work, and we have the opportunity to do that. And that's true across the different sectors we work with. Anthony mentioned earlier the work on the responsible contracting work and intersection in Canada, and our local up there was working very closely with your team on that report. We have the issue of healthcare issues, which we'll get into later. And in long-term care, well, before I get to long-term care, we should mention SEIU is the union that really sponsors and backs the support of fast food workers organizing across the United States, who also have faced great tragedy in the time of the pandemic. So, I mean, in long-term care, the story is probably, if you can pick, and I don't want to put one tragedy over the other, but this space has just been decimated by this pandemic. And unfortunately, it didn't have to be. And I think this is where the interests of shareholders, investors, policymakers, and of course, all of us who have loved ones who end up in a long-term care facility or may one day end up in one, need to look at this moment as a moment to say never again. You know, in the United States, we have, as of official data, as of the beginning of this month, we have 65,000 deaths in the long-term care sector alone, which is roughly a quarter of the total deaths. And these are the documented deaths. I mean, we all know that the data is actually undercounting the number of people who have lost their lives in this pandemic. So this is just an absolute tragedy. In Canada, the information is better in terms of pure numbers, but I believe one study showed that 80% of deaths in Canada related to COVID happened in long-term care facilities. So you know, I'm no expert on, all of you are more of an expert on what's happening in Canada than me, but the data I read indicated this problem is also really plaguing your population. I mean, I think, and from our point of view, this does intersect. One of the earlier speakers talked about the intersection between shareholder workers issues and racial justice issues. And of course, the workforce here in the United States is who cares for people in these facilities and has also suffered a disproportionate amount of deaths, is overwhelmingly women and people of color and immigrants who are doing this essential work, but being paid very low wages. And especially if they're in a non-unionized work facility, really facing very difficult conditions. So, I mean, I think it's really critical for people to find out within their portfolio, you know, do you have exposure to long-term care investments? Because I really don't think that the industry will be the same after this pandemic is over. I just think, you know, look, people want to have their loved ones cared for. We all knew this sector had a lot of problems prior to the situation that we've experienced. But after this, I think anyone's going to be like, wait a minute, you want me to put my loved one where? And so that's, you know, obviously it's a human problem, it's a justice problem, but it's also a business and investor problem. Because if you have investments in these companies, you know, what does the future for them look like? You know, so I think we have, you know, what we're looking for are things that you wouldn't surprise you. We're looking for, you know, adequate supplies of PPE. We're looking for reasonable thoughts on how you do sick time for workers when they may be exposed to COVID, and how do you protect them and give them quarantine? Because these are workers, some of them making as little as $25,000 a year. So they have to work. You can't just tell them, oh, go take some unpaid time off. These are people who are really living on the margins in terms of how they actually make ends meet. So they're not going to take the time off unless there's compensation along with it. We we need the safety for people to actually organize in the workplace. This is a very difficult place to organize workers because of the constraints of actually having dialogue with workers. And the fact that many of these workers work multiple jobs over time and go from facility to facility, which is another transmission problem because the pay and benefits are so low. And then we have a whole series of incentive problems, at least here in the US, and someone else would have to give the education on the Canadian, situation of how these are paid for. But in the US, the incentives are that for people who really are the lowest income patients, they almost inevitably, all studies indicate, get the worst care. And so the incentives are all backwards in terms of ensuring that you're not just actually making money while people are dying in your facility. So there's lots of important work to be done. And I think,
Michael, let me jump in there because
yeah, sure.
lots of important work to be done. But speaking as a union, there's a clear sort of piece there representing workers in the sector. But how do you see, you've also done capital strategy stuff, as we said. And so how do you see investor engagement contributing to improving those conditions?
Yeah, I mean, I think, look, I'm gonna say that for us in the long-term care sector, it's been a challenge, mostly because of the structure of how long-term care facilities are owned, which is sort of some very complex ownership chain. But I think what we're seeing now is that there is really large numbers of investments in the private equity space into long-term care facilities. And historically, private equity is probably the most difficult asset class in which to try to engage them on worker issues, community issues, any kind of issue that sort of falls out of the realm of the traditional investment model. And so I think that's the work ahead of us. Is you see a lot of the largest private equity managers investing in long-term care and in healthcare in general. And many of them are all signed on to the principles of responsible investment, and they all claim they're super responsible. But when you actually drill down and try to find out, hey, what's actually happening in these facilities, in many cases, they have no idea what's happening in the facilities because they have farmed out the operation of the facility to a whole nother operation that is not accountable. And I think, the short vision is, one, I think that shareholders will play a fundamental role in this conversation as the investments continue to grow in this space, because we also know that there's going to be more demand for this work, even though we're on the one hand, we're saying, hey, who's going to want to put their a loved one in a facility? On the other hand, unless the health crisis continues to deepen and we actually see a demographic shift where life expectancies go down, we're going to see demand for this. So we're kind of in this space, like we've got to reset the model of this industry. And I think investors should be as interested in anyone in figuring that out. And I think our bias in that regard, unsurprisingly, would be that we need safe, secure, independent ways for workers at work sites to be able to speak up about what the conditions are that they're working under, and for patients to bring forward concerns so that investors actually have things they always ask for. Investors like transparency, they like accountability, they like disclosure. And yet in this space, you don't get it, or you get it after the fact, like, oh, everything's wrong, wow, and we've already lost this many people, workers have suffered these things, family members are, and profits will be threatened. So, I mean, I think there's a lot of work to do to just sort of raise up some basic standards in this space that shine a light on what's going on so we can reconfigure sort of the social contract on how we take care of our loved ones in these facilities.
So I definitely see a couple of things there in the investor agenda. One, of course, this transparency, the idea that there's systems of accountability and an ability to raise grievances. That's not unusual. You take that up in all sorts of other circumstances too. And then delving into private equity investments to get down that chain and see where the investments are, who's managing them, and where the fault lines are. So I'll maybe come back to those if we have time, but I do want to give this question of, okay, that's an investor role and clearly fits with an investor stewardship model. But in Canada, and this maybe is happening in the States too, I don't know, there's in the public policy arena where there's an active debate about whether government should be taking a bigger role in controlling the facilities overall. And I wonder so is there space for shareholder action even when that kind of debate about government action is ongoing? Like, can we contribute to a solution here, or is it really all about public policy?
Yeah, I mean, look, I've been blessed to do this work for almost, as Kaylie mentioned earlier, over 17 years. So I think that these things are most effective playing with each other, right? Like, I mean, I've done capital stewardship work where we have had a cold stone lock argument And yet, if there was no action among workers, if there was no policy debate, if there was no concern among other stakeholders, it usually didn't move the needle. But I've also been in the other situation. Workers are really organized. Policymakers are discussing things. Investors are totally disengaged, and we also don't move the needle. So I really think that the conversation is all of these things impact behavior. All of these things shape the agenda at hand. And so I think it's really important. I mean, you can see if we can get, we have several examples of this historically, but if we get a US senator, for example, down here to write a letter to a company saying, hey, I'm looking at legislation on because I've heard that whoa, all of a sudden the company's like, hey, wait, maybe they'll figure out, sometimes they'll figure out the connection, and all of a sudden our policy shop's getting a call from the company saying, well, like we could talk, we're not so sure about whether we want a policy solution through a legislative thing. And I think the opposite is also true. You can see investors, when they chime in, you can see a policymaker who previously wasn't moving because, everybody has an interest. I think the key for us when we look at this work is our job is to, one, make sure that the union's program is that workers across industries across this country and across Canada and Puerto Rico, where we represent workers, have the opportunity to live with dignity. So that's our first mission. The second mission in our space is we have a fiduciary duty to make sure that our members get a retirement, we have members in pension trusts of over $1 trillion in capital. Just to take the biggest, in California, we have over 200,000 members in the California Public Employees Retirement System, which is $400 billion of capital right there alone. So the issue for us is, look, yeah, we need to make profits and turn something that allows the returns to be there for the fund, as someone else mentioned earlier in this conversation. But we need to do it for the retiree who needs a check right now, and for the 24-year-old who just signed up for public service and 60 years hence is expecting, or 40 years or 30 years, whatever it is expecting a check, right? And these issues are really about long-term possibilities of investing. I believe most of the investors who participate in this conference today are not short-term investors. They're looking for a sustainable opportunity to either support their organization through an endowment or support the retirement benefits for all the people they participate in. And in that regard, all of these issues are actually central to fiduciary duty and to investment strategy. And anybody who's telling you otherwise is really driving you into a short-termism that is really one of the greatest threats to the returns in your portfolio. As we unfortunately experienced in 2008, where I think short-termism overwhelmed the marketplace, and all of a sudden we were like, whoa, this is all falling apart, until we had massive intervention.
And so it does. The reason I think I ask these questions is because there's the criticism, of course, is that this for-profit model of long-term care is part of the problem. And of course, the for-profit model is where we come into it as shareholders. I mean, we hold shares and there's presumably our profits here, and they come back to us. But I'm getting that maybe it's not an irreconcilable conflict in this case, that there's still a role to play. I'm just
yeah, I think there's a reckoning to be coming. I think that there could be responsible profits made in this space, but currently, I think I have to be honest that, again, and I happen to live and work in California, so I have some more data on this, but let me just pull this data up. 90% of California nursing homes are privately owned. And as a result, it's very clear that in research from UC San Francisco, that the facilities that are owned for-profit chains have lower staffing levels, more regulatory problems than nonprofit facilities. And in those facilities, there were over the last 4 years, there were over 4,000 citations and penalties. So investors have to make a choice, right? You've got to really have a conversation with people in this space. Like, are you guys going to actually become a responsible actor in this space? Because if not, you're not going to deliver long-term profit and returns for us. This is not the kind of space where you can just go in and pillage and then be like, okay, I'm out. So I think the reputational risk and operational risk on that is serious. So I think there absolutely is a space for an increasing nonprofit service in this area. And then I think it's, the issue of investors saying, hey, we're exposed here. Do you have a business plan that is long-term and sustainable? And I would say the exposure already exists. On a personal level, if we could do all of this nonprofit and run for the benefit of citizens, I think in many social issues, from my personal opinion, that is actually a better option. But I think what we have to realize right now is that there is tons of capital shaping how these policies play out. And so we've got to be proactive in addressing the investor space.
Thanks. that gets at the issue. I think there's so much more we could do here. I'm aware I only have 1 minute left here. So that does kind of limit us. Any parting thoughts on this to say, like, if you had to do one thing as a shareholder now, where would you start?
Yeah, I mean, the parting thought is, and I think this is true, you also are talking about other healthcare issues. I think the main thing is, one, be engaged, and two things that I think we're emphasizing right now. We're really demanding that companies allow workers an independent, safe voice. People are asking for them to disclose risk in their workplaces. We want the workers to actually be able to verify those disclosures, because most companies are going to report everything's fine. I can tell you with 18 years of this, of course they're going to tell you it's fine. But do you have a way to talk to workers independently and see if it's fine? And secondarily, I think the issue of racial justice is forefront of this sector. This is an overwhelmingly sector where the workforce, and in many cases the patients, are people of color, particularly in the US context. And if that issue is not addressed front and center, you're going to see continuation of what are 400 years of bad acting and racism impacting not only those people, but also anybody who's invested in those spaces. So those are the two things I would focus on. And I thank everyone for the opportunity to share some thoughts today.
Thank you, Michael. I really appreciate you being with us, and I'll turn it back to Kaylie to wrap things up.
Thank you to both of you. That was a jam-packed 20 minutes. I feel like I got a lot of information and also some sort of big things to think about in terms of public policy and where we can make a responsible profit, and also some action items. So all of that was fantastic. Here are a couple of things sort of that I heard, and one is that there potentially is a responsible profit to be made in the long-term care sector, but that responsible profit making is going to require a heck of a lot of action from investors, which then also coincides with the two poll questions that we had about whether or not people on this call have talked to their investment manager about the social implications of COVID-19 on their portfolio, which I believe most people answered no to. And then the second question was, is there a role, or do you agree or disagree with the statement that only public policy can make the changes? 90% of people disagreed, implying that investors do have a role to play in this. So those two things together, I think, lead to an action item, which is talk to your investment manager about this issue. Seems like what we heard even from the beginning of the panel is the squeaky wheel or the repetitive reminders is what actually gets action. And so that's what we can do. Thank you for joining the second Share Religious Investors Workshop. A special thanks to our three panelists and our guest, Michael, for sharing your insights and all of your experience. Also, thank you to Damon and Moore for managing the video conference of the technology aspect of this, and also for setting us up ahead of time with registration and logistics. Those of you who have participated in the past in-person workshops will know that they were a great opportunity for learning and meeting new people. Hopefully this was the same, the learning as well as the mingling and small groups earlier today. Registration is open for the final 2 online workshops for religious investors. If you want more information, please contact info@share.ca. So that's an email address, info@share.ca. Finally, there is an evaluation questionnaire that will be sent shortly. Share would like to make these sessions as high quality as possible. So any feedback that you have helps us to continually move that forward. We just see a couple of comments coming in here. And I also did note that there was an awful lot of conversation happening in the chat with some frustrations that people had and those sorts of things. And I hope that continues. Okay, and the final word, thank you very much to Peter Chapman for putting all of this together, organizing all of the speakers and making this event happen. And with that, have a lovely afternoon. I look forward to meeting you again sometime in the future.